continuing to set up these workshops. It's something that's really needed in our communities. So mahalo for the opportunity to come and talk to you folks today. Also, thank you to the Office of Hawaiian Affairs for the support for this. This is, I think, critical. Issues around iwi Kūpuna are probably up there, I would say, in terms of things that are continually impacting us today as Native Hawaiians. So having these types of workshops to empower our communities are really important. So today, the topic is genealogy, and I've been working with Kekuewa to try to figure out like what is an appropriate amount of information to kind of focus on today. I will say that this is a topic that's dear to me, as I'm sure for most Native Hawaiians, because genealogy is such an important part of our identity. I would say that for me, genealogy was probably my first research project that I really tried to take on. And my awakening, I would say, as a Native Hawaiian, didn't really happen full force until I was in college. I think graduating from Kamehameha schools, growing up, not really in the country, but more Kaneohe side, Winter side, hey, I had some sense of Hawaiian identity, but it wasn't until I went to college that it was sort of a question inside of me to really understand who my family was, because I don't think I always paid that close attention. And I think, at that age, you're trying to figure out like who you are and what you want to be in your life. And so it was a real critical time for me. And genealogy in the beginning was to just answer the fundamental question of who I was, who was my family, and how far back did it go, and where did they come from? And so it started me off really on a journey to understand those things, to reconnect with distant family members that I haven't either never met or haven't talked to in a very long time. It strengthened, I would say, the kalina and the connections between all of us. It introduced me to the complexity of research. And it eventually led me down the road to major in Hawaiian studies and go on this as a career path, eventually focusing on cultural resources and archaeology, but really Hawaiian studies and Hawaiian knowledge was the thing that hooked me in. And genealogy was that first thing. I will say that since then, I've come to realize genealogy has a much broader important role than even just understanding your family. It's an aspect of preserving ancestral memory inside of us to keep those memories alive, the relationships alive, the interactions alive, and to remember the historical events of the past and to make them relevant in today's present. Genealogy is really the basis of the Hawaiian belief system because it helps to trace our origins and lineages to our ancestors and is the source of mana. And I think most importantly, genealogy gives our lahui and our community structure again because of the colonization that's happened with American imperialism taking over our country. I would say that, over the years, we've suffered generational trauma. And as a result, the loss of identity has really left us in a place where, at one point at least, we were really struggling to understand what all of our collective roles were within the lahui. And, I think we're getting out of that phase now and we're moving towards resurgence and empowerment, but it was definitely something that was affecting us for a very long time. So today I want to kind of link genealogy to spirituality, mana, what it means as a Native Hawaiian, and start to give you folks sort of the lay of the land. And so some of the things that I learned about genealogy is that in the beginning, when I was just kind of starting research, I would go about it kind of haphazardly. I would, like today, you'd probably go to ancestry.com first, right? Something like that. In the past, we didn't have ancestry.com in the late 90s, mid 90s. So I would end up going to the Mormon church, and look at those records. But what I've come to know as a Hawaiian studies major and now a professor is that It does require you to familiarize yourself with sort of the lay of the land, what's out there in terms of resources, um, and to understand how those resources change from different eras of genealogy, because the genealogy is, from now till the beginning of time, right? And so each phase of sort of this that we'll go over today has a different sort of sources of information, and it also has a different methodology of how you would go about gathering that information. And so what I'm hoping to do is to give you that lay of the land today, not just talk about why genealogy is important, but get a lay of the land. And also we'll go into the differences between the different eras of genealogy and the types of sources. And then also in the beginning, especially like today's time, modern times into the kingdom, what are some of the strategies and places to look for those resources? Because when you do genealogical research, you have to understand it's a long-term process. And so for me, I'm still doing my genealogy research. I've done a lot, and especially in my early 20s, I was able to get a lot done. But it kind of ebbs and flows throughout your life when you have time, when your interest kind of peaks again. And something that takes a very long time and takes a lot of you know, it's a lot of grit for you to just keep going back and searching for things. Yeah. So we'll talk about some of that today. First off, I wanted to talk about the term Moʻokūʻauhau. We know it as genealogy today, but embedded in some of these words are different concepts and ideas that really give us a sense of what it means for us as Native Hawaiians. So like any words in Hawaiian language, they're usually comprised of compound words or root words. And a good way of like trying to understand a term in its totality is to break it up into these root terms and to analyze all the different sort of definitions of those terms. I like to do that. I feel like it gives me a very good understanding of maybe the kauna or the multiple veiled meanings that could be embedded in these things. And so let's do that for this term genealogy, Moʻokūʻauhau. So the first definition that I saw that primarily popped up in almost all the dictionaries. So these are some things I just pulled together and made composites of from Ulukau, looking at all the dictionary definitions and kind of putting it into one for each term. Moʻokūʻauhau. So mo'o refers to a line. Kuʻauhau is a history, a story, a genealogy, and it also means attacks, though, or attacks, or so what I would describe as sort of like a duty owed or a responsibility. So those are all kind of terms that might not make sense in a Western sense, but in a Hawaiian sense, they see these things as all interconnected. Kuʻauhau, when you look up that, I saw that it meant that ku was shortened for the term kuamo'o, a path, and auhau, a lineage. So this idea of a lineage, a path of your identity. A kuʻauhau can be a person skilled in genealogy or tradition, a historian. It can also mean anything relating to what is registered or retained as historical, which is palapala kuʻauhau, genealogical register. It can also mean honorable or distinguished. So definitely positive terms associated with these ideas of kuʻauhau. It also means to be recorded in genealogy, in history and tradition. So the grouping of genealogy, history and tradition all together, as sort of a singular concept here. So that's really important also to highlight, because you see all of these things as interconnected, whereas I think in Western society, you see these things as sort of a little bit different. They're the first ancestors of Hawaii, which are noted in genealogy. That's a term that was in there. It also means to have knowledge of genealogies, to know the path of the descent of chiefs. To know the path of the descent of chiefs. That is to be distinguished. That is to be honorable. that is to be a part of our genealogy, history, and tradition. So auhau, when we look up that word, again, that root term means a tax or tribute, a revenue for the benefit of chiefs. Auhau, a place for collecting taxes, similar to ho'okupu. Again, I feel like it's kind of tied to this concept of duty. Like it's not something that you just get. It's something that comes with responsibility embedded in it and duty embedded in it. So that is something that I think that is uniquely different maybe from Western society and those concepts. And then the last I thought was one of the most interesting is that auhau also means the femur and the humerus bones of the human skeleton. It's not depicted here in this figure that we found online for some of the Hawaiian terms, but it's interchangeable with the femur and the humerus, which are the long bones of the body, of the arm, and of the leg. So what is this? Why would these things all be together? Well, in Hawaiian thinking, all of these things are interconnected. And so genealogy, tradition, history, duty owed, a pathway of descent, a lineage, is all of a part of identity of us as Oiwi, people of the bone, yeah, literally people of the bone. And these main terms that are used, things like kua mo'o, the backbone of our body, auhau, which is the standing thigh and arm bones, have to do with the skeletal structure of our body that allows us to stand upright. Yeah. So these sort of references to bones in these genealogical terms are the things that give us structure in our identity as Native Hawaiians, as Oiwi, people of the bone. So those are some of the things that you'll find if you look at sort of definitions of genealogy. So in that sense, genealogy is really the core aspect of who we are. And in a physical sense, bones is the embodiment of our identity. Genealogy is also seen as a kuleana, yeah. So when we talked about a duty owed, how it is the duty of every Kānaka to maintain knowledge of their genealogy. And the Maka'ainana, which was a newspaper that ran in the late 1800s, had a issue on April 20th, 1896, as part of a extensive genealogical series that spoke to the importance of genealogy and history of our ancestors and our responsibility and the responsibility of everyone to maintain this knowledge. The value of genealogy means that you're educated, you're enlightened, you have history, you have a responsibility to your birthplace. It goes back to some of those terms with Moʻokūʻauhau as being honorable, as being distinguished. So the excerpt from that newspaper in the preface of this series on genealogy says, "Aole ho'i kakau ia ana ki ia I mea I lohi wale no ihono. Aka I mea naka hanauna ho e ho'o maupopo I hoai ma ka ho'opa'a ana ma ka pu'uwai. O ka maupopo ka mo'olelo nā Kūpuna o Hawaii nei. O olelo ia he kua'aina ka mea ike ole I ke kūauhau. O ka mea ike he ali'i no uia. Ai ole he he Kānaka no ke alo ali'i. Ma Europa, he hupo ka maupopo ke Kānaka I he mo'olelo ole nele ho'i I ke kūauhau o kona aina hanau a me na aina mālama e a'e. O laila, pehea la, e ho'o ili ia ana, I think I have some of the typos in the transcriptions called my ka hanauna ho o Hawaii nei ma ka papa o na po'e kua'aina a me ka hupo. Na a'ole pela a laila e imi koke a ho'omaopopo I ka mo'olelo oia i'o me ka kūauhau o Hawaii nei. So this is not being written as something to just give upon, but as something for the new generations to learn by heart, and as something by which to understand the history of the ancestors of Hawaii. It is said, the one who does not know the genealogy is a rustic from the back country. The one who knows, he is a chief or a person of the court. In Europe, the man who does not know the history and lacks genealogy of his birthplace and other enlightened lands is a recognizable fool. Therefore, will the new generation of Hawaii be changed to the class of backward and ignorant people? In order that this should not occur, quickly seek to understand the true history and the genealogy of Hawaii. So it's pretty clear that knowledge of self and knowledge of your ohana and your genealogical lines is important in our society. And this is the reason why is because it comes with kuleana. Yeah? To know yourself means to know what your role is. It means to know how you can serve the lahui. And those are essential to the well-being really of our community and who we are collectively. Some things that I feel like I need to explain a lot of times, and a lot of people know this already though, but if you don't, that genealogy is always linked with status and rank and mana. And this framework is it's the basis for Hawaiian worldview and Hawaiian religion, I would say. And so genealogy, you come from a primary ancestor in the past, going down to the next descendant, to the next descendant, to the next descendant, all the way down to you, right? And status and rank moves up depending on your position on this hierarchy pole. And so in our culture and in our society, we are ancestrally based sort of religion and perspective. And so things of the past, things connected to our ancestors are seen as having more mana. And on the mana scale, mana climbs as you get older. Yeah? And so if you're a keiki and you turn into a opio, you get more mana. You turn into a makua, you move up ranks. As you become a kūpuna, you move up ranks. As you transition into po in the afterlife and become a spirit in the afterlife, continuing to live in the afterlife, you gain mana because descendants remember their ancestors, give life to their ancestors, worship and pray to their ancestors for help giving them mana. And there is a reciprocal nature of the ancestors who move up the ranks into demigods and gods. They give mana back to their descendants, yeah, by answering the call of prayers and worship. And so that's pretty fundamental to sort of Hawaiian thinking, yeah. And one of the things that I've started to realize is that this genealogy allows us to start to see time sort of in a cyclical nature or a repetitive nature. And that's something that I've started to think more deeply about as I start to realize that most of the world operates in a cyclical nature where you have, when you're out in nature, for instance, so, you'll see the sunrise, see the sunset, every day. It goes like that. Night, day, yeah. You'll see seasonal changes that happen in cycles, yeah. Same thing when you start to do genealogy and you start to realize that you start to know your ancestors. Yeah? So oftentimes we're unconscious, I would say. We're walking around thinking about, we might not know who we are totally because we haven't done our genealogical research. We haven't heard stories from our family. If you're in that position, then you might not be able to make the connections. Yeah, but when you start to research your genealogy, you start to realize that there is a part of all these ancestors in you. You start to see pictures, maybe old pictures of people. Like I'll see a picture of like my grandfather's sister that passed away when she was younger. And I'll be like, oh my God, she looks like my cousin, like the spitting image of her, you know what I mean? Or you'll see that you'll learn about, say, some of your ancestors' accomplishments or certain things that they did throughout their lives. And you start to realize that man, I'm kind of like that in the way I act, you know, like my interests are similar, or we start to walk on similar paths. And that's when the spirituality comes in for me, because you start to make these connections, and these ancestors are not people that are just deceased in the past, but their spirit lives on in the afterlife and is continually trying to communicate with you to maintain connection between ancestors and descendants. That's the basis of the Hawaiian worldview, yeah, around this stuff. And so genealogy is the critical link to make all these connections. Other things that you'll start to realize is that there's some really crazy, like intergenerational things that can happen, that it could go on undetected. Like there are people that, for instance, through my work in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, certain Kūpuna that were alive in the early 2000s that were friends with my grandfather. And my grandfather passed away when I was like 12 years old. And so I knew him, but I didn't really know him that well and what he did in his life. And I started to learn about what my grandfather did in his life through his friends that I met in the Hawaiian community, in particular as it related to the Northwest Hawaiian Islands in the area that I worked in, that I found out that my grandfather also worked in. So there's these serendipitous events that can happen that you might not be aware of unless you're really with the stories of your family and the genealogy. So I think those kinds of things happen a lot more than we realize, but it's because we haven't always maintained the details in our genealogy to make those connections and to maintain them. Some of the things I think that are important is that genealogy relates to legitimacy and position. So there is a saying, "Aya I pa'a ia ka maka, ha'i ia kupuna nana oia." So so only when your face is slapped should you tell who your ancestors are. And so how you use genealogy is oftentimes strategic in the past. It needs to be strategically deployed. You don't go around bragging about your genealogy. There has to be some level of humility about your ancestors. Hawaiian culture in general is a very humble culture, yeah. And so people didn't go around boasting about ancestors. They would deploy that information when it was necessary, and oftentimes that is if someone is challenging you and vying for your authority or legitimacy on a particular topic, and or when you need to reestablish pinina and relationships with people to remind people that perhaps you are related and that we come from similar ancestors and we need to be working together on things. So it can be an adversarial thing, it can be a cooperation thing, it can be something that is generally tied to politics. So in the Hawaiian language newspapers, there's quite a bit of Moʻokūʻauhau scattered throughout all the different newspapers. It was always a hot topic because different historians, different genealogists would promote particular histories and genealogies, and others would write rebuttals. And these things can be pretty fierce. We've never dived into this stuff in the Hawaiian studies classes, but I always thought that we could develop a graduate course on genealogy, because some of the articles are like just straight fire, man. Like they are criticizing them, and the poetic references and the kuamuamus that they're using to criticize each other are just amazing. I didn't put them here though. The example that I put here was of Samuel Kamakau, who we all know as a famous Hawaiian historian. He gives a sort of a genealogical sort of statement in a newspaper, Keao, in July 23, 1866, responding to critics questioning his ancestry. And I have a picture of Kukani Loco here with Lihue in the background because he's referring to his connections to these lands. Yeah? So he says, on the side of my mother of Manaya on the side of the mother of Manaya Kalani, SM Kamakau, Iha Pupu was the child of Ka'uaua Kalani, daughter of Ka'onohia Okala. and Le Hulu Hulu Nui a Kamau, the daughter of Kalani Ho'one'enu, and Ka Ho'owaka Kananuha, Eva Uli o La'akona, and Eva of La'akea, and Hoalani, ever rises, ever lives. And he also goes on to say the lands of Manuaula in Kamana Nui and Wailua is the placenta. From the cliffs of Lihue, of Kukani Loko to Wahiowa, of Moho is the afterbirth of my ancestors, of my father. The placenta and the afterbirth of my mother are from Waikele and Kalawao, the Eva of La'akona. 40 generations or more relating to my parents, said the victor. You have found it in the float of the outrigger, when the skill and truth are known. So those are kind of like poetic, I think, cuts or figurative ways of saying things. But basically some of the stuff he's saying is that I have the genealogy of these places that I'm talking about. And if you're going to question me, let's just lay it out there, right? And so he gives his genealogy on his mother's side, on his father's side, and he starts to link it to this idea of homeland. Yeah? So homeland and genealogy sort of go hand in hand, because in the past, people weren't moving around kind of like how we are today. A lot of our genealogies are somewhat mixed and convoluted because of the way Kamehameha has united the islands in late prehistory, the formation of the kingdom that created sort of a national identity for us as Native Hawaiians, and it kind of did away with some of the sort of the tribal sort of identity that we had before, where our genealogy is linked to particular regions. And so today it is very common for Hawaiians to relate homeland to the entire archipelago, but in the past, there was a lot more detail into that because we knew our genealogies very well, and we knew that we came from particular regions or particular islands, and those details are important to us. And you will see that in the burial laws today. So we have things that link lineal descendants up to the exact people that you are related to, and then you have this idea of what is the term? What kind of descendant is that? The community descendant, but the
cultural? Is it cultural?
Cultural descendant, which is someone that can trace their genealogy to a region. Thanks, Ka'ahiki. And so those are sort of artifacts of the past where we still believe that, especially when it comes to things that are core to our genealogy, like Iwi Kūpuna, that we need the detail. We need to know who truly has kuleana, who truly has legitimacy and rank to take on particular roles, because how that is treated is important to us in the past. One of the things that you'll notice here is that there's a reference to the afterbirth, the placenta, yeah, and this idea of kanu or burying is burial is essential to genealogy and our connection to land and mana and legitimacy, because our connection to land generally before was over generations. And so we would be living in the same general region, maybe moving ahupua'a, but generally the same region, maybe some movement outside of districts, maybe some movement outside of islands, but a lot of times much more staying in one place. And so that is important because people would live and die in a particular area. And so this process of kanu or spiritual connection to this idea of homeland would generally stay the same. And so when you are born, your mother gives birth to you. After you come out as a baby, your placenta comes out, your pico placenta, that gets cut. Generally, that gets buried in a particular place where your family has ancestral connections to, usually in what you consider your homeland, and that starts the spiritual connection of the child to Aina. That child grows up, goes through different phases in life, lives their full life, or not, passes away, and then your iwi are buried into the ground. where you're from, generally. That's how it was in the past. And so when we talk about ideas of homeland, there's generally two terms, yeah, like Aina Hanau, One Hanau, sands of my birth, lands of my birth, and Hulaivi, the plains of my bones where my ancestors are buried. Those are the two primary sort of periods in our lives, beginning of an end of a particular cycle where we are connected to place. Yeah. And that connection of having your placenta buried in a place and your iwi kupuna buried in a place gives you legitimacy to speak for your ancestors and to speak for the place. Yeah? And that's really important as well. I would say in the past, not everybody kept super detailed records of their genealogy. If you were to think about rank and status in the past, it's kind of like a pyramid, yeah. And so obviously there's this idea of primogeniture where throughout Polynesian societies, the firstborn son typically has sort of the birthright to take over leadership and rule. And the highest born people were generally groomed to be leaders in the past. And so they had a particular function in society. Over time, as the Hawaiian population or any Polynesian population grew, this became a huge pyramid where a very small percentage of the top are genealogically positioned to take on the highest ranks of leadership. Everybody else, if you are born of a second or third son, and that is amplified over generations as each generation gives birth, if you keep getting born from the second son, third son, fourth son, or daughter down the line, you just keep moving down the ranks, basically. And so if you can think like by late prehistory in Hawaii, most people were not totally keeping track of all of their genealogy. I think there's so many generations that you almost have to dedicate your life to some of this when there isn't books, because a lot of it is based on memorization and reciting genealogies. And so that's a full-time job to try to remember those things. And so what would happen is that a lot of regional places just link their genealogy to the chiefs. Yeah, and so we might not have a full range of genealogies of the past, because that would be so many people, yeah, that it would be almost impossible to chart out and to have them expect them to remember all that. But we have a national alert warning, hurricane warning. But what they would do is that they would link to the chiefs, and so if you had particular chiefs that were famous, say for Ka'u on the Big Island, they honored their chiefs. It represented like their older brother or their senior lines that they would honor, that they would feel indebted to, that they would take care of, because they're the leadership of like sort of the clan. And their genealogies were the most important to remember, because essentially if you remember the most senior genealogies, everybody is related to those genealogies anyway, so you don't have to remember all the details of everything. You know? So that's kind of one way I think they manage some of that. In terms of lay of the land, these are not, I've created sort of like these phases of Hawaiian genealogy. And these are not, these are just terms that I've heard. I don't think it's, like set in stone, and definitely not taught like this. But why I think it's important to break this down is that each period evolves differently. There are different types of resources that you would look, and it's telling you different things really. And the sort of the accuracy of reality gets a little blurry as you move farther back. So let's go over some of these. Each phase has its own info, its own sources, and methodology of research. So the cosmogonic period. Cosmogonic means like really ancient history. It ties us to the origins and the creations of the world. And we remember them because they're typically the things that teach us the core lessons of values and how the world came to be. It links us to the very beginning. Yeah. And these types of genealogies are vast. They're generally in the form of chants or fixed texts, because it required genealogists to recite them verbatim. so that they did not get anything wrong, because there's so many generations, hundreds and hundreds of generations of cosmogonic period that links us even before the birth of man into the birth of the universe and the world and the natural phenomenon and stars and skies and all of these things. So that is one period of genealogical research, which we will not go over today because that's really its own beast to deal with. The next phase going down, moving from ancient to modern, is the mythological period. And I would say that, moving back, the main example that we'll go over today for the cosmogonic period is the Kumulipo. It is the most comprehensive cosmogonic genealogy that we have. So I'll go a little bit over that for you. The mythological period is the next period. I would say that this also is embedded with values and lessons of how things came to be. You won't just see it in the form of fixed texts or chants that have to be memorized word for word, but it is also in narratives and free texts that has some level of storytelling and embellishment in it. These two are forms of oral traditions, like the cosmogonic period chants that were recorded in the 1800s. But the reason why they're called oral traditions is because they were actually passed down through word of mouth through the generations and preserved that way, eventually being recorded in books and publications. Unlike written history, which is sort of like firsthand observation of things that are written at the time by people that actually saw it. The main example that I'll go over here is Papa and Wakia, because they are really a core taproot of the Hawaiian genealogy that people need to know as a reference point in this huge, vast spectrum of generations that span down. After that comes the chiefly period. These are oral traditions that are still have chants and mo'olelo, but they're more historical in nature. So they don't have too much like mythology and sort of like supernatural things in there. It's just telling kind of a plain historical record of events that happened, battles that happened, who married who was fighting with who, kind of like a dramatic soap opera of Game of Thrones. That's sort of that phase of recording that happens, tells the historical events of the past. And sort of the main example would be like the book Ruling Chiefs, because it's just all these different stories from Hawaiian language newspapers that are compiled together. There are also numerous series in the Hawaiian language newspapers that are not in book form yet, that tell of different chiefs and their accomplishments during their era. Moving down today, which will be kind of the focus of today's second half of today's workshop, will be the kingdom period. This is post-contact, where we became an independent state and recognized as independent across the globe as a nation. This is a period in which Hawaiians have learned how to read and write, and there are written historical records based in first-hand experience. These examples of this would be government records, land records, marriage, birth, death certificates, census, tax records, etc. Much of this is modeled after Western society and how they structure their governance. And so Kipo'o will be going over some of these types of research in the second half. And finally, we have like post-kingdom territory and statehood. I see that as a uniquely different sort of period as well that we'll go over today, because it has particular types of resources, again, written records based in firsthand experience that we use today. So that's kind of general phases. I would say that knowing that there is this timeline and spectrum, and that it goes back hundreds and hundreds of generations, is important, so that you know that how you're looking up records in the kingdom period is definitely how you would not, is not the same as how you would look up genealogies in the cosmogonic. It's almost like separate classes in each phase. So let's go over the cosmogonic period really quick. The Kumulipo is probably the most important reference that you'll need to know if you ever get this far back. or are just interested in this time period in general. It is a Oli Ho'okumu Honua, or cosmogonic creation chant that tells of the formation of the universe. It is one of the longest chants in our traditions, 2,106 lines long. It is done in 3 times in history that were pivotal transformational points, like when Captain Cook came, the birth of Kalani, well, first the birth of Kalani Nui Ia Mau Mau, which was an important chief in the 1700s. But later on when Captain Cook came, and the other one was when Ke'eo Moku passed away at Koko Head, I believe, closer to 1800s. So those are 3 major shifts in Hawaiian history in which Kumulipo was recited. Yeah. Kumulipo is a super thorough cosmogonic creation chant. And it divides the formation of the universe into 2 halves, Po and Ao. It is divided into 16 Wara eras, 8 in each half of Po and Ao. As time moves progressively, genealogically, from the earliest life forms on Earth, like the coral polyps, into marine life, into birds, mammals, insects, and so forth, towards humans, the birth of humans, and the different lines of chiefs that came to settle the Hawaiian Islands. Why this is probably the most important chant to look at is that it incorporates most of the other 9 well-known established Hawaiian creation chants into a single unified record. There's a lot of other smaller chants that are published in Fornander, Malo, other well-known historians like Kumuuli, Vela Hilani, Kumuhonua, Ololo, Paliku, Uanue, and some others that are smaller creation chants, but they fit in like a puzzle into the Kumulipo at different phases. Kumulipo goes past the cosmogonic period into the mythological period with Papa and Wakea, the different ruling chiefs that come to settle the islands and start to create lineages. So that is sort of that phase in sort of a nutshell. One of the cool things about the cosmogonic period, I would say, is that if you can get your genealogy this far back, I mean, it goes into like sort of the creation of the world. Yeah. So I have not been able to get this far back. I'm still working on some of my lines, but my wife's genealogy goes back all the way to the beginning, the first line. So that is something that is a goal, I think, for people. They're doing their genealogy. The mythological period. I use Papa and Wakea as an example because they are what I consider like a taproot or a mole of genealogy. So it is a story that is published in the Hawaiian language newspapers as He Mo'olelo Hawaii Kahiko, Ancient History of Hawaii by Joseph Poipoi in 1906, as well as portions of it being published by other historians in their books and chants that all kind of piece together sort of the story of Papa and Wakea. It explains the importance of Papa and Wakea as the 2 primary ancestors to the Hawaiian people. They have been mythologized in a way as a sky father, earth mother, as ways to honor them. They are responsible for giving birth to the islands and Kānaka. That gives us a relationship between people and homeland. They're responsible for giving birth to the stars, and eventually the kalo through haloa that gives us connection to the sky and the seasons and time, as well as the primary staple of our people. Wakea is known as having set up the sort of the framework for traditional Hawaiian society, religious practices and prayers, temples, heiau, and aikapu restrictions on eating and times of worship. So these 2 people had huge impact on what Hawaiian society looked like moving forward from their time all the way up until the time of the kingdom, really, where things started to transform and to shift towards Christianity and more Western models of governance and structure. And they are primarily responsible for giving birth to the different chiefs that would go on and establish lineages in the different kingdoms in Hawaii, from Kauai Ni'ihau, Oahu, the Maui group, and Hawaii Island. And so Papa and Wakea are super important. And let me say about this. Yeah. Okay, so no, the other thing I was going to say, and Papa and Wakea are particularly important because people need to understand in terms of like the mole, like what Kumolipo outlines is like a framework of all these genealogies that cascading down. Yeah, I mean, you have different lineages that are happening, and Papa and Wakea and that story is really the first story of power and sovereignty being consolidated in our islands under one rule. And so there's a battle between Papa and Wakea and Kumuhonua, Kaneira Kumuhonua. They become the victors, and as the victors, they become the forefathers of our Lahui. And so all the other genealogical lines that might have existed at that time are no longer like remembered, and that the people that move forward are all of us today. We are all the descendants of Papa and Wakea. Yeah, all the other lines did not move forward after that because they're the ones that won. So we remember them as our forefathers, foremothers. That's one of the reasons where it doesn't become, I don't want to say a bottleneck, but it filters down to that point and then it spreads back down again. And so the chiefly period, the next period, is really the establishment of island lineages. So there are numerous published accounts of chiefly genealogies that all descend from Papa and Wakea that spread out and become established on the different main islands. There are approximately 50 generations of chiefs from Papa and Wakea until the time of Kamehameha. And I would say this chiefly period ends at the time of Kamehameha because he unifies the islands and the descendants under one rule. So that's something that isn't always emphasized, but you know, what happens is that the descendants of Papa and Wakea get established, and there's a lot of political jockeying that happens throughout the generations. Everybody is essentially from the same taproot. Everybody is related, but it all spreads out into these lineages. And when Kamehameha unifies the islands through warfare and through marriage, is essentially uniting the descendants of Papa and Wakea under one rule. Yeah, and so this is something that no descendant was able to do until Kamehameha came to power because of his mana, his knowledge, his strategy, and his support from the people. He was able to do this. This period of time helps to understand the history of politics and control of these islands, as well as the evolving relationships over time between genealogical lines and regions. We can understand why particular regions had alliances, why some particular regions didn't get along historically. It is just an account of how things sort of played out throughout history. Yeah, and so that's pretty much just stuff in a nutshell. Ruling Chiefs is probably the book that most people start off with, but there are numerous Hawaiian language mo'olelo just focusing on particular chiefs from different islands like Lonoi Kamakahiki, what was some of the other ones, Kakuhieva, different chiefs that lived during their times and the politics of what they had to encounter. And so if you are doing genealogical research, you're going to want to try to push through the modern era into the kingdom records, and the goal is to link up the chiefs. I have this funny story when I first went to the Mormon church, into their resource center. I didn't really know what I was doing in the beginning, right? So I'm just looking up Mormon records and asking people for help. But in the back room was sort of like the chiefly line room where the Kūpuna would sit and kind of hang out and talk story. And they told me, when you can link up to the chiefs, then, or when you get all the way as far as you can into the 1800s in the kingdom through documents, come back over here and come and meet us, and we'll help you link up into the chiefly genealogies. Because in order to go back farther, you have to link into the chiefly genealogy staff. If you cannot do that, then your genealogy will stop during the kingdom period as Native Hawaiians. So this is just a map of sort of the archipelago. You can see some of the generations of chiefs over here. These are actually the generation of rulers. They're not just family line generations, and so they're not totally all the same. It just gives you an idea of some of the names and people that were in charge during those times. And you will see that Kamehameha ends up at the end of every list, yeah, because his family becomes the rulers of Hawaii, moving into the kingdom period, establishing the monarchy and then the government. So that's kind of all I have today. I didn't want to go too much into the kingdom period and the kind of records over there and into the territory and statehood, because that's something that will be covered in the next sort of phase with Kepo'o as we talk about strategies and places to look. But just know that genealogy is important. It's linked to our identity, everything about us, spiritually, politically, culturally, and that you have a general framework here of the vast span of time, all the way from the beginning of creation, where time is vague and you don't exactly know when that was, but you know, in sort of mythological times, all the way up into the modern era. There are phases of genealogy, and each one requires you to look at very different kinds of sources, and to have a different methodology of research for it. The reason why we are focusing particularly on the modern era with statehood, the territory of Hawaii, and the kingdom is because if you haven't studied your genealogy yet, and this is just a beginner's class, it will take you quite a while to get through those phases of history for the past 200 years. I would say I'm still not done, and I've been doing this almost for 20 years. You know, I've been able to link up some ways, you know, in past that, but you know, it's there's so many different types of resources that you know you want to do a thorough job as you're moving backwards and leave no stone unturned. And in order to do that, it takes time. So focusing on the modern era and strategies there, and then possibly moving into the kingdom era, that will take years to do. So that's something that we wanted to focus on today, to get people started. Mahalo. So I wanted to open it up to any questions you guys might have. Hope this made sense. A little bit harder to talk on Zoom and be clear with all these screens going on and stuff. So I hope it was clear. Mahalo.
Mahalo nui e Kekuewa. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to jump in. You can unmute yourself and ask, or you can pop your questions into the chat and we'll keep an eye on that. Anybody?
Aloha, Ka'ahiki speaking. I wanted to say mahalo, Kekuewa. It really helps us to give us a foundation for this learning. I'm very excited about it. I love how you presented the makavalu of the terms, because it's so important for us to be able to understand exactly what we're doing, what we're endeavoring to accomplish here. You know, we really need to go deep there and go all in with this, because it's a heavy kuleana that we're all just the knowledge, just the ike that we're learning is very heavy, but I very much appreciate it. So mahalo ya'oi. Oya valeno.
Yeah, don't be shy if there's questions. There's no dumb questions. I mean, there's actually so much stuff with genealogy that it can be really overwhelming, to be honest. And people take classes on this at the university for semesters, so you know, just know that there's it's normal to have a lot of questions and trying to understand this. And if you guys have comments as well, there's a lot of experts in the crowd right now. I can see photos of like Malay, feel free to chime in. Yeah. A lot of people with a lot of EK in here. We tried to make this more of an intro thing.
I have a question. I was wondering if, like, when you are doing genealogical research, if you ever come across like certain ohana that possess like superpowers and stuff. Because when I was doing my genealogy, we've come across people who were kupua, and so I don't know if it's just like, I mean, I know, like you said, we all related, but like, is that something you normally come across?
Well, I haven't for other people, but I do have a story about my family. Like, what was really weird was, so I have a line from Keanai, Ka'ahanui Pivais, that goes to my great grandmother, who was Lilinoi Kamai. She was like a half brother and sister to Ahanuis, which are also known as Akionas, are also related to them from Keanai. But I don't really know that side of the family very well. And a lot of it is through documents and the few people I've been able to talk to. I've been still trying to make like in-person connections with people. But there was one Kūpuna that was descended through a collateral line, Edward Akiona, who becomes an informant for a lot of people for Keanai when he was still alive. And this was in the 50s or 60s. And when I was going through the Hawaiian language tapes, the Kaleo Hawaii tapes, I came across a tape of him by Larry Kimura. This is even before Kaleo Hawaii. This is like one of the first tapes Larry Kimura did, I think, that is in the collections at Hamilton. And he interviews Edward Akiona, who was the half brother of my great grandmother, about stories from Keanai. And so he talks about how there is this story of, I don't know if you guys ever did the assignment Pepe Mano in 201, 202. Did you guys remember doing that, UH Manoa, Pepe Mano? It's kind of like a narrative about how a child is born at EPA or some kind of afterbirth thing. And then the child dies, and then the mother puts the child into the stream, and it turns into a shark with like a red tail or something like that, or a red marking. And that baby shark swims in the pool and lives there for a while and is fed by the mother, and eventually goes down into Kilo Bay and becomes like the Aumakua of the area. That was a story about my great-great-grandmother, my great-great-great-grandmother, and one of the childs that she had in our family genealogy. And when I saw that, I was like, oh, that's pretty trippy. I don't think I've ever seen something like that before. So I think there are things like that, but usually when I'm doing genealogical research for other people, I'm not looking for all of those stories necessarily. A lot of it is trying to prove their genealogy for like DHHL or things like that. So I've helped people do that kind of stuff, and usually it's tied to just more plain government documents that helps to establish linkages. So I haven't gone into like fleshing out people's entire family histories, except what I'm trying to do for my family. So I have come across a story like that. So.
Mahalo. Any other questions?
Yeah, so a question Kahiki has is, what is a collateral line? So one of the strategies we'll talk about in the second half is that, genealogical research, obviously you want to try and show birth of the descendant from the mother and father. And those mother and fathers, you want to show their mothers and fathers, and their mothers and fathers, and so forth. But what happens usually when you're trying to do research is that there's always a time when you're going to hit a roadblock. And if you hit a roadblock, I always say like go collaterally. So that means to try to find out who the brothers and sisters are and start to query them, because you might find information if you go sideways, then back up through the brothers and sisters, the aunties and the uncles, and then go up. Sometimes it's not a direct path, and you'll get total blockage if you try to search under the names of your direct ancestors. But this is particularly true if maybe your ancestors don't have records or didn't maybe do particular things in their lives, or don't have a lot of records about them, and that maybe you have an uncle or a great uncle that was really famous, like a historian or someone in the ledge or something, and you find a lot of information about them, and you'll be able to move back, go upwards that way. So that's kind of what I mean by collateral.
I have a question, Kekuewa.
Yeah.
You know, when it comes to the placenta,
Yeah.
and are there any laws on that? I'm just thinking, like, for people that live in the city and they don't have a aina, like where they are, or access to family kind place. Is there laws against where, or regarding where you can put that kind of stuff?
I'm not sure about the placement of it, but there are laws now protecting protecting people's right to take the placenta from the hospital. And that's stuff that Kihei Nahale'a folks have been fighting earlier on and won lawsuits. NHLC has been really, Native Hawaiian Legal Corp has been really critical in supporting those types of lawsuits to basically get hospitals to adopt those policies to let it go. So for when my two daughters were born, their placentas were freely given to me without any struggle. Unfortunately enough to live on my grandparents' property over here, so we planted it here. Right. I know other people have been struggling as to where to plant it. Oftentimes, we're using modern sort of strategies. So what people do is that they end up freezing it to buy themselves more time as to figure out where to bury it. So some people have been freezing it for years, not knowing exactly where to plant it. So that's something I think worth talking about as a community, whether, landholders like Kamehameha schools might be willing to utilize communal spaces, or nonprofits that are running aina-based education might be willing to use their spaces as community spots,
Yeah, I was just even thinking about the ohana that take their, maybe not so much the placenta, but the pico up to Waiau up here. And just, I didn't know of any laws like saying because of that whole thing with the management issues, if there was anything to follow.
Yeah, and I think that this is one linkage where we can make too, between Ieve and Iwi Kūpuna. To me, they're very similar things. And so when people are saying, oh, there's no burials on Mauna Kea or whatever, well, I do know people are taking their picos up there. So there are body parts that are being buried, in particular places. And I think that's a burial, And so even when we're trying to reinvigorate these practices for Ieve, because there's not a lot of detail as to how it would be treated, I utilize sort of my background in Hui Mālama and working with Hale Aloha folks on how to rebury Iwi Kūpuna, the wrapping process and stuff like that, to wrap the afterbirth in the same way, like a body, and burying it in the same manner. Again, changing the chants and stuff like that to fit the occasion, but to me, tukanu is tukanu. And so it's kind of the same thing,
Okay. Mahalo nui.
Mahalo.
Mahalo. So we have one more question here, and then to be respectful of everyone's time, we'll take this question, go to a break, and then we'll continue afterwards. We may end up going a little bit over 12 p.m. But if you do have any other questions, please continue putting them in the chat, and we'll find a way to address them. But yeah, so we have a question from Malia from Mālama Molokai. When you learn more about your kupuna, do you feel a need to take on more kuleana to Mālama, their area?
Absolutely. I think that's the goal of the workshops too, is to raise consciousness of our communities that you do have a responsibility to particular areas. There is so much action going on in terms of archaeological work and things throughout development, things throughout our islands that are impacting burials, that we need a community that is awakened and engaged in this issue. So, because we need watchdogs everywhere. Right now, there is not enough men defending the posts, men and women defending the posts in all of our communities. In some areas, there are not enough descendants to really have any backing and support. We need to develop a system that is really hyper-reactive to address these things, or proactive, really proactive to address these things, to organize and get the right supplies, to have the right training, and to be vigilant in defending these things for our community. One of the things I learned from Queen Mālama being, especially Hale Aloha Ayao, who has been really at the forefront of this whole thing, you know, all of these things these traumatic problems that, you know, we've had over the years through colonization, having our governments and land taken away, you know, that's all, you know, evils that have been done to us. But one of the worst evils has been the desecration of iwi kupuna. In Hawaiian thinking, that directly affects your health and well-being. So if you have health problems, are economically disadvantaged, if you're having, you know, mental health issues, things like that, in a Hawaiian way of thinking, it is affected by iwi kupuna because we are not taking care of the bones, and the integrity of the spirit of our ancestors in the afterlife is being directly affected, which goes back to that model of reciprocation between ancestors and descendants. Descendants are healthy because of the well-being of the ancestors. And the spirit of the ancestors are healthy because of the well-being of the descendants. It has to go back and forth. To not have that connection and to not address that is to ignore the larger problem that's happening.
Mahalo.
So yeah, regarding the need to take on more kuleana to Mālama and area, through these workshops, you should be able to learn how to figure out who your family was more far back and be able to link it up to particular places. I think that's the next workshop with Kepo'o. But the idea is to eventually try to register people to be cultural descendants for particular areas and to build a sense of kia'i and community there so that we can empower ourselves to make the right decisions. Genealogy is really critical in this because not only does it teach where your position is, it teaches you what your role is. So we need to have greater discussions about the different rankings of genealogy as well. I've always felt that the way it's set up, where you have lineal descendants and community descendants, is not enough, because it gets convoluted as to who has the authority to speak on behalf of the group, because there might be more than one person, right? So with a lineal descendant, it's very clear because it's probably the oldest person in the family, although that should probably be, clarified, and someone that has direct descent to that person. But the community pot is way too big. There needs to be more rules and regulations as to how particular things are privileged. And in my mindset, it has to take into account things like when age is one. The other is like, are you currently living in that area or did you decide to move away? Because I feel that the people that are continually living in that area, being kia'i, have unbroken chain of responsibility. They have a higher rank than people whose families decided to move away. It's not that the people who decided to move away don't get a say, but we have to recognize the authority of the people that live in that area and have more direct pilina. So it's just try to like entangle all these little differences so that we can have a very clear process in our community and that we're not fighting each other when it comes to the determination of how these bones should be treated. We need to get that clarity and internal structure developed for ourselves. That's something to be, we should discuss in my opinion. Sorry, I talk a lot. I hope I'm not boring people out. Sometimes I'm just like rambling on forever.
No, we're gonna let you talk as long as you have the ideas flowing. But mahalo nui. I think we're gonna take us into a break right now, and then we'll follow up with Kepo'o, who'll be speaking to us next.